Hey everybody, my name is Robius and welcome to a new episode of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. In this series, I compare events in a selected character's life within one of the Assassin's Creed games to the actual history the individual lived through. As always, beware of major story spoilers. For today's episode, we will be exploring the real history of Woodes Rogers. As always, I will begin by sharing with you his pre-game history, which is somewhat extensive, then we will continue by analyzing his in-game history, and lastly I will be comparing the events represented in Assassin's Creed 4 to the real historical events in his life. So, let us begin with his pre-game history. Rogers was born in 1679 in the town of Poole, which was located in the Dorset County of England. Although he spent a portion of his childhood there, he soon moved to Bristol, where he learned the profession of being a sailor as a young man. As he completed his apprenticeship in 1704, Rogers soon married Sarah Whetstone, who was the daughter of Rear Admiral Sir William Whetstone, which therefore aided in solidifying his position in higher society. However, within the next 2 years, his father, a successful merchant captain also named Woodes Rogers, died at sea, and therefore left all his ships and business to his son. Following these acquisitions, Rogers and his wife soon had a son and 2 daughters. When the War of Spanish Succession started, Rogers began to lose a few of his ships during the fighting. Therefore, he soon took to privateering to make up for his losses. He was soon approached by William Dampier in 1707, who offered that they set up a privateering expedition against the Spanish. Rogers agreed, and with the help of Bristol's community for the required funds, the two set off, commanding 2 frigates named the Duke and Duchess by August 1708. They spent the next 3 years circumnavigating the globe. Although there were initial issues concerning mutinies and crew members, these were soon quelled. Rogers' crew stocked up on alcohol and blankets, which would later be transferred into clothing for warmth, and lime, which they could use to fend off scurvy. Their voyage brought them near the Drake Passage, off the tip of South America, but they went even more south and nearly reached what is now known to be Antarctica. They eventually reached the Pacific Ocean and headed for the secluded and nearly unknown island of Juan Fernandez. What happened next is very interesting. As they approached the island, they saw there was a fire, and they initially feared that the Spanish may have been waiting for them. However, once they got on the island, they discovered the Scottish sailor Alexander Selkirk, who had been stranded on the island for 4 years. He was rescued and made part of their crew. The interesting part is that Selkirk became the inspiration for the novel Robinson Crusoe, which was written by Woodes Rogers' friend Daniel Defoe. Following this chance encounter, they raided and captured a few ships and managed to hold an Ecuadorian town for ransom against the Spanish. Eventually, they captured the Spanish vessel Nostra Señora de la Encarnacion y Desengano near Mexico, which was a very rich prize for them. However, during this battle, Rogers received a scar on his face. For those of you who were curious in the game, this is the point in his life where he got that infamous scar. They then began a journey home, stopping in a Dutch port where they sold one of their captured ships, and Rogers had a piece of a musket ball removed from his mouth and face. When he got back home, Rogers was in a lot of legal trouble for dealing with the Dutch against English policy, and through his own debt and family debt, his voyage was overall unprofitable, and unfortunately cost him his brother, who died in one of the battles, and left him disfigured. But in the end, Rogers was considered a national hero in England. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, return with his original ships intact, and with most of his crew, along with a few Spanish ships to show his prizes. Now, after a rather extensive pre-game history, let's get into his in-game history. Heavily in debt, Rogers had to sell his home in Bristol, and after his 4th child died at birth, he and his wife Sarah soon separated. Deciding the best way to get out of debt was another expedition, Rogers planned to go to Madagascar and purchase slaves that he would bring to the Dutch East Indies, all while gathering details of the pirates of Madagascar, that he hoped to either destroy or reform. It was here where he prepared his initial concept of offering the pirates a pardon in exchange for their ceasing of criminal acts. However, although his trip was profitable, the British initially refused his idea, which was differently depicted in AC4, where we hear Rogers talking about his successful removal of the piracy in Madagascar. With this failure in hand, Rogers changed his view to the West Indies, where he convinced the new king, George I, to allow him to create a company in the Bahamas. On January 5th, 1718, Rogers got his wish, and a pardon was offered to all pirates who would have to accept it before September 5th, 1718. Rogers was given the title of Captain General and Governor-in-Chief, and by April, he set off with 3 Royal Navy vessels, 100 soldiers, 130 colonists, and a large amount of supplies. As he arrived in Nassau in July of 1718, Rogers trapped many pirates, including Charles Vane, with the purpose of making them accept the pardon so he could establish his company and an effective government. Vane refused and used a French ship, which he lit on fire, as a way of distracting the British so that he could escape. With this final act of defiance, Nassau and New Providence Island were under Rogers' control. After forcing the pirates to accept the pardon, Rogers put the population to work in rebuilding. He was soon threatened by Vane, who claimed that he and Blackbeard would attack and retake the island. However, he was also threatened by the Spanish, who wished to take the Bahamas. Among other things, such as a large portion of his crew dying due to a disease, and mutiny and departure of some of his vessels, Rogers was in a difficult position. As he worked on rebuilding the island's fortifications, Rogers heard that Vane was at Green Turtle Cay and sent 2 former pirates, Benjamin Hornigold and John Cockram, with a crew to locate him and, if possible, to kill or capture him. After an extended voyage, in which time Rogers fortified Nassau, Hornigold and Cockram returned with the information that Vane had evaded them. Hornigold was then sent to hunt down Rogers' ship that had mutinied, and he returned with 10 prisoners and 3 corpses. This entire episode with Hornigold was rather well represented in AC4. The Spanish later made an attempt to capture Nassau in 1719, but Rogers' men managed to keep them at bay, and they eventually left. At this point, Rogers was in a rather large amount of debt, and when he eventually returned to Britain, while he was sick, he was imprisoned for debt and was replaced as the governor of Nassau. Again, this scenario is rather differently represented in the game, as he knew about his lost position before leaving Nassau, although this did make for an enjoyable spectacle.
And yet, for all my successes, His Majesty has seen fit to sack me and call me home to England. Brilliant! God bless the fucker!
Rogers was eventually released from prison when his debts were absolved. He was again considered a national hero and was reappointed governor by the king's son and successor, George II, in 1728. There were many issues in Rogers' second term as governor, and he eventually passed away in Nassau on July 15, 1732. In summary, there were a few differences between Woodes Rogers' actual life and his representation in AC4, but I for one was very interested by his extensive and unexplored pre-game history. However, firstly, Assassin's Creed claimed that he was successful in ending piracy in Madagascar, which was not the case, but this did lead him to successfully eliminate it in Nassau. Secondly, quite evidently, he was depicted as a Templar in AC4 who worked with Governor Torres of Cuba, which could never possibly be proven. Thirdly, he learned about his deposition as governor prior to arriving in England in the game, which also wasn't the case, since it was a surprise to him once he was imprisoned. And lastly, AC4 implied that Edward might finish his assassination of Rogers in England, when, in reality, he returned to Nassau as governor and later died there. However, all other elements were very well represented in AC4. And on that note, we have wrapped up another episode of Assassin's Creed, The Real History. I hope you have all enjoyed this rather long video, and if you did, I highly recommend you try out one of the Assassin's Creed games. Thank you all for watching. Please leave any suggestions for future characters you'd like me to cover in the comment section below. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in a future historical episode.
Principe, you mad bastard.